Hello and welcome to the 136th episode of From Alpha to Omega. Today is Thursday, the 29th of October 2020, and I'm your host, Tom O'Brien. We speak with Arnold Schroder, host of the very interesting new podcast, Fight Like an Animal, about the science behind his synthesis of behavioural science and political theory. Let's join the discussion. So Arnold, you've recently launched a podcast. You're about 13, I think, episodes in. What's it called and what is it all about?
So the podcast is called Fight Like an Animal. And I guess there's sort of like two ways to justify the basic premise. And one is like in terms of my own experience with politics. And that would be, I'm 42 years old. I entered sort of like radical, anarchist-y politics when I was a teenager. So I've had a lot of time to grow very weary and disaffected with a lot of the things that people are often really skeptical of or frustrated by in egalitarian politics in general. And for the longest time, I really convinced myself that it wasn't important, that hammering out differences in perspective in terms of like core theoretical assumptions about the world or how people behave or whatever kind of wasn't really that important. And I very much approached, because I think that I approach any kind of political work from the assumption that people are going to have really different perspectives, and from this assumption that, the actual work is sort of like reconciling perspectives along lines of overlap and figuring out shared projects and things like that. So, I just for decades, I spent my actual time and energy in politics just organizing. And then in parallel, just as in terms of my own like intellectual obsessions, I was always reading cognitive science, evolutionary theory, and any huge number of disciplines that, that are like that have a sort of like quote unquote hard scientific dimension that relates somehow to behavior. And at a certain point, I guess I'm going to say it was like 2017, 2018. Two things kind of happened simultaneously. One is just that my perceptions of where the climate crisis are at sort of shifted, where I felt like we could decisively say that climate advocacy of any kind had been a failure. But then also I found over and over again that I was encountering these situations where it seemed like it actually really did matter, that people's conceptual tools and like basic frameworks for approaching any sort of political situation, any organizing or whatever, that some of the really deep assumptions that people were bringing into that really were affecting our ability to organize and communicate. And in particular, like kind of decide who should even be making decisions and like what an alliance looks like and what the basis for cooperation really is. And so I found myself really just like wanting to articulate some of these divergences that I had with a lot of the basic assumptions that I found in movements. And so after some more years of, wandering around, grieving and sort of like coming off of a very frenetic resistance trajectory, I started making this podcast. And so, every episode, like I feel what I'm bringing, like the work that I do to justify people listening to me talking alone for like 2 hours at a time, is I read a bunch of evolutionary theory or whatever. Like I read a bunch of scientific papers, and then I try to relate that content to mostly just to my experience of politics, but also, to like stuff other people say about politics too.
So I suppose we may do a bit of a dive into some of these papers now that you bring them up. Like, because you've gone through a lot of the papers. I've listened to, I think, all your episodes, some of them more than once. So, okay, hit us with some of these papers you think that meaningfully explain or critique, either explain your experiences or critique the existing, say, kind of dogma about organizing on the left. From your point of view, is probably more the anarchist left, I would say. So God knows there's enough bullshit around Marxist fucking organizing. So let's jump in.
I think an interesting place to start, it's not where I started the podcast, but I did do this 4-part series called Nature, Nurture, Death Spiral, where I was talking about some of the ideological conflicts in social sciences as they sort of developed and matured in the 20th century, and how I feel that they are playing, that those kind of like rhetorical devices that were used in some of these like very early debates before we really had, I mean, before we really knew, you know, like science was definitely not in the place it's in now 100 years ago. So like before we simply had accumulated a lot of the information that we've accumulated, there was an exceptionally racist camp of social scientists who were using Darwin to claim, you know, I mean, we still find people articulating variants of this theory today, of course, but, you know, to justify this premise that people who have, well, first of all, that societies with less technological development are somehow inferior, which I was really unclear that that's like an obvious, that part of the argument was just taken for granted, but I think it's entirely unclear that's the case. But then, you know, that the reason that these inferior societies existed was because people were like genetically predisposed to creating less, you know, glorious civilizational achievements. And so that camp, Francis Galton and those folks were, you know, super foundational to the eugenics movement, super foundational to like the Nazis did in fact read them and were in fact influenced by what they said. And, you know, and so, I mean, that created a perception that I think continues to this day, that if you talk about evolution, it must be like a, you know, you must be like 1 or 2 steps away from saying some racist shit. And like, you know, what I would say about that though, is just that, first of all, like people have invoked all kinds of crazy nonsense to justify their racist perceptions throughout time, you know, and that's exactly what it is. It's always a post hoc justification of like a perception, like a perceptual bias that they have. But early 20th century social scientists who were more, I don't know, who I would personally share more values with, more like egalitarian oriented people, fought back against that in a way that I think was like, I understand the motivations, but it was very like, I kind of just like a pure reaction, I would say. It wasn't really grounded in any sort of like empirical or theoretical integration at all. And they, you know, so they started claiming that there just absolutely was no human nature. And that in and of itself, I think, leads us into very weird places. I mean, I would say that, you know, the most obvious, agreeing with Chomsky, is just that if there is no human nature, there's actually really no reason to fight against fascist dystopia. I mean, if we are simply the products of socialization and society can tell us to be anything, then really what's the problem with society telling us we can't be gay, or telling us to work 16 hours in Elon Musk's lithium mines, or what the fuck ever, right? But
Bring it on.
right? But this led to all these weird, I would say that these academics painted themselves into some corners that they absolutely did not anticipate. And one of the things that came up, you know, whereas originally this school of thought, this like egalitarian social sciences school of thought, used phrases like the psychic unity of mankind, which I think, you know, minus the gender specific language, is very much, I think, like a very valid perspective. But very quickly they got into this place where, in order to sort of demonstrate the infinite plasticity of humanity, like any time that we see a recurrent set of behaviors everywhere people are found, then we can kind of say like, well, it seems like that must say something about human nature. And so they painted themselves into this corner where they had to claim that people were infinitely arbitrarily different between different groups, between different cultural groups. And so anthropology became this enterprise, anthropology in particular, this enterprise of claiming kind of like ridiculous differences between people, claiming that people in one culture had no sense of time, or people in another culture like kind of literally had no pride, you know, all this stuff that just sounds very counterintuitively not human. And then over time, that sort of same thinking started getting applied to groups that have different experiences of socialization, but might share essentially kind of one sort of material society, you know, like people like along like ethnic and gender lines and things like that. And so the most interesting thing that's happened politically in the United States recently has been the uprisings against police violence, starting with the murder of George Floyd. And I would say that like that's as good an illustration of any of how these notions that we should assume people don't share a perspective at all because they come from different like social groups, have had different experiences of socialization. Like it's a great illustration of how that's still really burdening us, because we're still having these like insane debates that all rely on that assumption that there's like over and over again, we have to tell people that there's not a monolithic black political perspective. But the idea that there is, that like if like there's some liberal black person saying, don't break windows, stay on the sidewalk, like fighting the police is bad, whatever, like I promise the Minneapolis City Council is really going to defund the police, even though this looks like a liberal, let's study the issue with a committee kind of bullshit thing. Like over and over again, we have to say like a black person doesn't speak for all black people, but there really is like there's this framework that for as much as I don't think most people have ever read those like early social scientists, they're still like operating under these assumptions that that groups are infinitely arbitrarily different, and that they all kind of like it forces people to not look at the individual psychological variation that exists within a given group of people and how that maps out to like different political orientations, perspectives on the world. So that would be like one example that's pertinent to today.
Yeah, like it's interesting. You mentioned, say, for example, how, you go back 100 years and the debates very quickly settled into kind of camps. I've just been reading recently a book that's talking a little bit about Edmund Burke, like this asshole Irish conservative philosopher. And he was like, in response to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, was writing up some like economic value theory of his own. And he essentially basically mapped out the fight between like the idea that labor creates value, and he went into the basically like a neoclassical one of where it's like it's all subjective. And it's like you have that demarcation split, like in, I don't know what year it was, like 1806 or something. And it's the exact same argument we have today in economic theory between value and subjectivity, that it seems like that very quickly, like in new academic fields, they settle, particularly when they're more social science, they settle into politically, ideologically useful camps than, say, for example, would do in a harder science. But like, even when it comes to the hard science, I've been reading a little bit about like some physics stuff about, I don't know, have you ever heard of Bohmian mechanics?
I don't think I have.
Right, so this is kind of wacky, but it's like around the time of like when they were coming up to come to terms with the quantum stuff, and the idea of like the electron goes both ways, and it settles on one way, but only after you observe the effect. And at the same time, there was like this, I think it was de Broglie or something, but it's since been developed by an American guy called Bohmian. And he was saying like, actually, no, like it doesn't split. It actually goes one way or it goes the other way. And he came up with a classical kind of interpretation of what happens. And it didn't really get anywhere. But recently, you can look at it on YouTube. It's goddamn fascinating, right? There's like, you can replicate. There's a certain type of oil, like a cheap type of oil, right? And you can heat it up and you can get yourself a cocktail stick, right? And you can pull the cocktail stick up out of the oil and it'll create a tiny little bubble and it'll bounce on top of the oil field. It's too light to recombine into the actual water. So, but it keeps itself as a bubble, like a little sphere, and it bounces up on time, and it replicates at a macro scale, quantum scale phenomenon. Okay, and so it bounces there, and all these different weird effects, like quantum effects, operate on the macro scale, and they send it. They've even got it doing the pilot this where they have the two slits, and they send the little blob towards where it would split, but very depending on tiny little differences in the bouncing of the waves, it'll either go one way or it'll go the other way, and it'll replicate the distribution that you get from the idea of a collapsing wave function after the observer. And so you can actually see that even when it comes to the hard physical science, that there is the bias, say, between idealism and materialism, and we're getting it right there on the fucking quantum level. And I feel like that do you want to talk about what, for example, what you were talking about, like the what happened with I think Margaret Mead when she went to Samoa and all the craziness that she decided to come up with.
No, totally. I mean, yeah, I do want to talk about Margaret Mead, but in just like in a more general, a broader sense, I mean, I think that Chomsky said in his debate with Foucault something that I just thought was so genius, and I had been thinking for a long time, which is that any conceivable science necessarily reflects some sort of like pre-existing structure in somebody's mind or another, and like to the extent that we have a structure in our mind that maps to physical reality in some way, then we have a science, and to the extent that we don't, that's the extent to which we just don't fucking know about the world that we live in. And I was first so impressed by that with Einstein, actually, and how much his physics, which turned out to like really accurately describe certain elements of our world, were just like, I mean, it just sounds like some totally internal mental phenomenon. Like, I understand he definitely like did some reading to get where he got, but when he actually describes his process of like developing the theory of relativity and stuff, but he describes these processes of just kind of like conceptualization and visualization that most people wouldn't experience, that turned out to be really useful for describing something that actually externally exists. But there's this like really clear sense on which there's this totally like unique subjective element, like a pretty much like almost mystical aspect to like some of the processes of visualization that he underwent. And I mean, I think even if you look at the math that people employ in various scientific endeavors, you can see these sort of like ideological differences and these like just sort of core perceptual divergences. And the best example I have is I went through this phase where I was maybe like 7-8 years ago, where I was reading a lot of assessments of the vulnerability of fossil fuel infrastructure to different kinds of like attack. And so you have the guys in America, you have like the Defense Department guys who are doing like this very like linear, like, we did vector calculus and this is how we interdict threats, and then you have some like European scientists who are on this way more like everything is interconnected and all is one trip, where they're like, everything is a system comprised of systems and all boundaries are fuzzy. You can actually really see, like, you legit see these two totally different worldviews in the math that people are using, like one that really dissolves boundaries and one that really reinforces them, which I would say is like a core distinction in how people see the world that maps out to like tons of like really important sociopolitical differences too. And so, yeah, I mean, so like, I totally, like, for as much as I'm the guy who's like, people should listen to like hard science and we should base our radical politics on that, all the critiques about science being laden with values and there being no way to escape like the perceptual sort of like biases that you bring, like all of those things are true. And so, yeah, I mean, like the early 20th century social scientists, like, I don't even really know how to like characterize their perceptual biases, except to say that I think that they were trying to describe a sort of utopian humanity that almost nobody, like in 2020, almost nobody believes in this form of humanity, but they were trying to describe a humanity that just like could be any way, like literally had no innate structure whatsoever, depending on socialization. And so Margaret Mead was foundational to this enterprise. Like those social scientists spent like, I mean, more than a decade just arguing this in principle, like in this really general sense, without offering any sort of like case study. And Margaret Mead went to Samoa with the specific intention of showing some aspect of human behavior that was so different from anything anybody encountered in, I don't know, the cultural milieu she was operating in, the West, America, whatever. that it would prove that, people can vary infinitely in any particular way. But like, what's so striking is that even though that's kind of that's nice, that's a nice idea, or it's at least not like insidious, she ended up totally dehumanizing Samoans. I mean, she ended up making them these like caricatures of people had in their minds this idea of Pacific Islanders as like, it's all kind of like dancing to some flowery music and some like beautiful topless women on some beaches swaying in some grass skirts and some like lovemaking and some huts, like they had this very like tourist brochure sort of like free love idyllic version. And she went to Samoa, and I don't know. I mean, the sort of like generous speculation is that her informants, which were mostly adolescent girls, just sort of like played a joke on her and just told her a bunch of stuff that isn't true. I think a less generous interpretation would be that she kind of just made some stuff up because she had an agenda, but she describes Samoans as lacking hierarchy of any kind, really lacking any kind of sexual jealousy, like lacking, like not knowing what rape is and lacking a word for it, so subsequent anthropologists were like, well, here's the sort of elaborate cultural framework in which rape occurs in Samoa. And it is, it just sort of like all these other things. But I think the thing that really insulted Samoans the most, and the thing that the stuff that when I read it, I'm like, that's terrible, and is a premise for treating people as less than human, is all this stuff she said about Samoans just kind of like, and again, this is like reflecting the tourist brochure perception that people had of the Pacific Islands, but like they're just easygoing about everything. They just don't really care about anything. They have no like passionate convictions, and there's nothing they're willing to fight for. And she even says that they don't cling to life very dearly, which is like, I mean, that's like, yeah, like tell that to like the people who want to like, build the mine where they're growing their food or whatever, right? That's like I understand that her motivations weren't to like justify genocidal resource extraction or anything like that, but that actually is like, I mean, if that were actually true, I mean, it's not a good thing to say about anybody.
Yeah, like the idea that like Samoan like life, or these islanders like can't be aggressive. They should watch some goddamn rugby. See these total bulldozers of men being absolute bastards. They're brilliant. But like, it's kind of, it's mad, but it does play into the same kind of idea of behavioralism. It does play into that idea. If we look at, say, now I'm not an anthropology person with great experience or knowledge, but like, it seems to me that like, while her motivations may have been good to play against that eugenics right-wing kind of anthropological viewpoint, we got to kind of isolate maybe perhaps her intentions versus her theory's utility. And it would seem to me like for like class reasons, it would seem to be a very ideologically useful type of theory, for capitalists, Stalinist states likewise, that, you can actually just mold your citizen or to do what you want, and that they have no internal like defined human limits in any sense.
I mean, yeah, exactly. And Chomsky simply said the left should have a vested interest in innateness, and I think that's nice and concise and exact. It's like, yeah, like what are we fighting for if not some humanity that exists outside of like whatever external societal conditions tell us humanity should be? I mean, like there has to be something for there to be something to fight for.
A quick aside to thank the new patrons Larry McNeely, Carson and Ryan Mickler. Part 2 of this conversation is being released as a patron-only episode. So if you like what you hear, maybe you could become a patron. For only $5 a month, you get 2 free episodes and 2 live streams every month, access to the Discord server, and the right to vote on the next reading group series. And if you want your exclusive commie badge, make sure to sign up before the end of October. Your continued support really does make this show possible.
But the change is different from that ever felt before. The music music is listening.
That debate, you did an episode on the debate between Chomsky and Foucault, and like I haven't watched the debate in about, I don't know, like probably 7 or 8 years. But I find it that if you see on Twitter somebody saying, "Oh yeah, like Foucault obviously won that debate," you can nearly identify their politics straight off.
Exactly.
It's very difficult to watch that video and think that Foucault won. Like, as any kind of a scientist, or even just common sense, it's very, very difficult for to think that Chomsky wasn't correct in that video. Do you want to give us a bit of a lowdown for what the general gist was there?
Yeah, and I mean, and I do think that it's a decent illustration of how like capitalism and authoritarianism and all these other have actually found a ton of utility in arguments and modes of reasoning that were initially presented by hyper leftist academics or whatever. Because, yeah, I mean, like Foucault does this thing that I think is actually, I mean, is really common in authoritarian situations, where Chomsky points out these like concretely observable empirical realities. You know, like children acquire language without the kind of explicit instruction and the richness of information and stimulus that would be necessary to learn other equally complex tasks, you know, and he's like, that just kind of happens spontaneously in a certain developmental window. And then what Foucault ends up doing is like some variation on how do you know what you really know? Do you really know anything? Can we really know anything? Maybe things that appear very, very contrary to what you're observing are actually true. It's all like epistemological argumentation that just sort of creates like open-ended uncertainty. And I think that that's actually like, that idea is like that reality is a sort of core necessity for any authoritarian project, right? There's always a necessity to tell people to believe things that don't appear to be true. And it kind of doesn't matter what the content, like the actual like false beliefs are. It's just it's the social psychological process of telling people that they should believe things that appear contrary to their observations, and of just sort of like inducing this infinite confusion of just being like, well, what do you really know? How do you really know anything? And more his like, you know, so like Chomsky, he just never answers. Like Chomsky provides this really concise definition of what he thinks human nature is and why he thinks it exists. And Foucault doesn't really ever actually address that. He just spends all his time critiquing like kind of any sort of certainty anybody can come to about anything in any tradition of knowledge, certainly in the scientific tradition. But then he also, I think what's maybe even more interesting about it is that he also invokes a few lines of argumentation that are exactly what I personally, and I think a lot of other people, find so fucking frustrating about politics today, where, you know, like Chomsky is like, here are some concrete projects that I'm working on, you know, like this is my opposition to the Vietnam War and the moral considerations that go into it, and like sort of like why I do civil disobedience and all this stuff. And Foucault is like the guy at the meeting, you know, like when you're at the meeting and you're like, maybe we should do this. And people are like, no, let's just get lost in endless critique. Like, let's, you know, let's like critique ourselves some more and then critique some institutions or whatever. And he literally says, you know, like, well, I don't think that I don't think that you have the like epistemological foundations to ever like do the things you're talking about doing and know that they're not somehow like insidious on some level that you haven't analyzed, that you're not somehow like carrying the cultural baggage that you've inherited into your project of trying to build a better world. So let's just sit around and critique universities and like look for more inherited baggage. And as much as like it's always a good thing to do. It's always like a good thing to like examine where you're coming from and what your unconscious biases are. You know, at a certain point, you have to take your imperfect epistemology and do something in the world. And that idea that like everything should just be sort of like another round, like another session of critique and self-assessment is like, like at this point, I have this like crazy physical reaction to that because I've just been in so many so many political processes where it seemed like something was going to happen, and then some Foucault-esque argument got made, and it just shut everything down.
Have you seen there's like some document? I think it was the British came up with like in the 30s or the 40s for I think it might have been like for how to infiltrate left radical groups in Europe, and they're have you seen this thing? And they have like
no.
a 10 point. They have a 10 point list of all the things that you should do and how to mess up a meeting.
Right.
And it's literally the list is literally your experience of every meeting you've ever gone to.
Yes.
You know, and don't want to sound paranoid, but like like I think in the UK there was a big spying scandal on a lot of the radical eco groups and left groups. I think of 1,000 groups that they spied on in the UK, 3 were far right groups, 997 were left wing groups. So like the level of infiltration of groups by like bad actors, just it makes one paranoid. There was a guy I had an anarchist guy, an Irish anarchist who I had on the show maybe about 5 years ago, and he was saying that this one guy who's kind of like a famous spy that got uncovered by the Met in the UK, that he actually came over to Ireland and stayed on his couch for a few weeks. He was obviously doing like recon on some like tiny Irish anarchist group. I mean, tiny, like 30 people. So it's like you kind of sound like sometimes I feel like I'm losing my mind talking about this stuff, but it is like I do think that Foucault critique is a weaponized critique. And also it's like, why of all these great like actual thinkers, why does a guy like Foucault get such limelight?
No, totally. Especially like because if we lived in a world where there are any consequences for being wrong about anything, because I mean his most famous book, I think, is probably Discipline and Punish, which lays out this thesis about how the world is going to go, where it's going to involve less and less corporeal punishment and like incarceration and overt physical coercion in favor of a bunch of the kinds of things that he critiques, right? Like he's essentially saying like, well, the world is going to become a place where like power essentially exists as a function of the kinds of things that I spend all my time analyzing. So it makes him all the more important. But I mean, 50 years later, or whatever it is, 40 years later, I mean, I think that we can definitively say that he was pretty wide of the mark with the, like, we're not going to lock people up or torture them or physically coerce them anymore thesis, But yeah, I mean, I think that it's crazy because I've been in political processes where I know for a fact there were infiltrators, where it came out, there's documentary evidence like Standing Rock or whatever. And then I've been in a lot of political processes where there weren't, or there's certainly very little evidence of it, and it would be surprising. And the fucking thing is that the frustrating things were the same, right? Like whether it's an actual infiltrator or whether it's just somebody who is operating in the legacy of all these weird ideas that initially got kicked around in academia, and now they're like the bastard children of the bastard children of the bastard children of those ideas are circulating around political scenes, like one way or the other, the same kind of like pretty disastrous arguments and discussions just happen, like, whether it's an actual infiltrator or not. But I also do think, I mean, it's amazing. And on some level, if you're willing to look at things sort of abstractly, it's sort of truly impressive how much these ideas have managed to permeate and shape real world events. But I also really do think that there is some extent to which there's kind of like maybe in the last just like couple years, some real pushback on some of that I personally hadn't really seen happening before. And I think that's like partially, I started really noticing it at first in the Bernie Sanders campaign, and then continuing through the George Floyd uprising, where people were really willing to like publicly, I think that before that time, what I always experienced was people coming up to me after meetings, like in like kind of non-public spaces, and being like, the left crazy, like what, like, whoa, that was weird, right? But not really being willing to publicly push back. Like the moment anybody said anything was oppressive, the moment anybody said like, we're failing to consult X, Y, or Z perspective, and because people are infinitely different from each other, we have no foundation for imagining a sort of like shared perspective that we might happen with whatever group I'm identifying that's been socialized differently. People started really like more publicly pushing back on that stuff. And I think that's honestly in part, it's for a variety of reasons. I mean, I think some of it is just like people are getting more desperate and angry and wanting to do concrete things. But also, I would say that the sort of like actual establishment really overplayed their hands with stuff like that. So like these like kind of hyper academic notions of like group differences and stuff like that used to like mostly live in pretty properly radical political spaces, but increasingly like identity politics per se, and like all of these kind of like, well, whose perspective haven't you consulted, like making politics into the beginning of like an anthropologist's ethnography sort of arguments really got like overtly taken on by like the Democratic Party in the United States in their power machinations. And then, and like liberal mayors trying to tell people not to fight the cops and stuff like that. And then even by like the police, like even one of the cops' talking points at this point is like, does this truly like reflect the Black perspective? Like we're pretty sure we're in touch with like the leaders of the Black community, and the monolithic Black political perspective is that you shouldn't be like contesting power in this or that way. And so I think people are really just seeing in a like, without having to like argue through where any of the stuff came from or like its vaster meanings, people are just really seeing that some of these Foucault-esque, Margaret Mead-esque constructions of the world are used by the people they're sure are the enemy, and so that I do actually think that's diminishing the power that they have.
Yeah, like I think it's all. I like personally, I think it's a function of, we're similar age. I'm 43, so I win. I'm older than you.
You're all right.
You're you win. Yeah, I win. Yeah, I win. Yeah, good one, Tom. the one game you definitely don't want to win, unless you're about 20 and 21 in America, and then you can get legally served booze. Eh? But or 14 in France. The infinite plasticity. No, but like I also think it reflects a resurgence of radical left thought.
Yeah,
like I don't know about. You obviously got into radical politics way before I did. Like I got into radical politics after 2008 crisis, but I think that they're like, say for example, like you're doing your podcast now, right? I'm doing mine. I'm actually doing my podcast quite a long time. I'm doing it about 8 years, 9 years now. When there was only like 1 or 2 podcasts on the internet, there was about 100 libertarian fucking weird ass podcasts, right? You remember that period? There was no left stuff.
Totally.
We have a period now. It's like in the last 8 years, really in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen a massive explosion in I think not organized or good radical left politics yet, but we've at least seen a propaganda function develop. And I think the pushback against that type of, abuse of standpoint epistemology and all this is coming. I think people are getting wised to the games that are being played that I think were completely dominant. These are basically being used as kind of liberal, Democrat, whatever equivalent in other countries, organizational methods, that people are kind of rebelling against this. That at least, if anything is happening, at least we're starting to get a kind of a propaganda function for radical politics.
I think so. I mean, and I think that one of the sharpest divides, it's interesting because, yeah, like where I live, it's the Democratic Party, but, it's like they really frame all like political decisions and like political interests and like voting blocks and all that along all of these demographic lines, except for the one that's actually the most predictive. And that demographic line is just age, right? Like, and that I think that's partially you know, and you can see this, like, it's weird, like the lengths that like liberal corporate media goes to insist that that's not true are pretty incredible, where they'll do this stuff where they're like, you know, Bernie Sanders is polling well among young white people, but he struggles to connect with black people, except for young black people, which of course is another way of saying that he does well with young people, but not with old people, you know, but they always want to frame it in some other way. But, you know, like I think there's a few reasons for that. And you can actually look at, there's this really interesting theoretical framework called structural demographic theory that looks at like big moments of political conflict around the world and in the US in terms of just like when there were big pulses in like a lot of births, you know?
Yeah.
And it really is a thing where like, you know, young people are just inherently more rebellious, and they're more cognitively flexible. So they're more prone to being like, is this really the way things should work? Should we maybe do things a little bit differently? And they're more willing to engage in confrontations over that. But another reason for that is that, like, and I think I especially saw this in the Democratic primary that happened here most recently for president, was that, you know, like young people don't get their news from CNN or whatever. They get their news off the internet. And that was like, it seemed like the sharpest divide that I could find in terms of what people thought about the Democratic presidential primary was just in terms of like, if people were exposed to all of this, like, yeah, this very like burgeoning, flourishing scene of like radical left, egalitarian, anarchist media and propaganda that is coming out right now. And it's like, I think it's amazing. I mean, it's one of the things that I legitimately learn so much from listening to podcasts and reading people's pieces. And like, I'm super aware that if you're in a different, like, if you do like actually just get your news from somewhere else, you just don't see or know this stuff. But the younger generations, this is their information ecosystem. It's rad. I mean, it's just awesome. I love it.
Brilliant. Like, you know, I grew up in the middle of nowhere, you know, went to Catholic boarding school, blah, blah, blah. You know, I was exposed to nothing.
Right, yeah.
Literally nothing. Didn't know it existed. Would never come across it. These kids now, you know, people follow me on Twitter and that, and I think like they're like 14 and they're arguing about the ins and outs of the differences between Straffing economics and neo-Ricardian. And you're like, what is this? You know, what is this? I don't know. Yeah, so in that debate, Chomsky talked about the idea of like scientific research into the, if I'm remembering correctly, the scientific research into the nature of humanity, say. Have you followed that research?
You know, when they had that debate, social scientists were stuck in a holding pattern that they had been in, I don't know, since the turn of the century-ish or so, where anytime that an innate aspect of human behavior perception was discussed, there had to be a big Chomsky versus Foucault-esque theoretical discussion about whether innateness was even, you know, like whether there was human nature or whatever. And
can you teach a wasp to speak English? You know, that's the key question for me.
I mean, exactly. And that's like, right. That's the amazing thing, is that I think that if we talk about, you know, in like the terms we just discussed, where it's like people are always bringing ideological baggage or like fears and desires that they're not really articulating into any given academic framework. I mean, I think that like the ultimate sort of like reflexive fear that people in social sciences were indulging when they were like, there is no human nature, there's just like an infinite degree of variability, was this idea that, yeah, that like describing biology somehow is like placing these really like sharp limits, like saying that X or Y behavior or social dynamic is inevitable. But right, exactly. I mean, like, how can you just like describing human biology is describing the mechanisms for learning and variation, right? You know, so it's like there's been all this fascinating work. So that stopped in the 90s ish, where it was a thing where you had to have a big social sciences theoretical debate about innateness every time you like involved it at all. And the social sciences just kind of quietly, you know, often when these big scientific debates end, there's no great announcement. There's no, you know, nobody ever says like, this camp won and this camp lost. Like, but people just started like incorporating innateness in all of these different disciplines. And so like some of the really interesting work that illustrates this point that biology actually describes our capacity for flexibility, as opposed to like describing really sharp limits on what we can do, is all this stuff that involves like homologies between ourselves and other species in response to trauma and adversity, and like the notion of like an envelope of stress tolerance. And so when I say homologies, like I think that a lot of people who aren't as familiar with biological explanations of behavior, when they hear people say like the chimpanzees do this and humans do this, they assume that it's just kind of like it's mere analogy, that we're just kind of saying like these things are similar, and it's all just kind of this like literary process of saying, so like this is how nature is or whatever. But the gold standard in behavioral sciences is like, if you see for cross-species comparisons, if you see like relatively similar behaviors, you want to see similarities in brain activity, similarities in like physiological function, like levels of circulating hormones, neurotransmitters, things like that. And so there's this really interesting like homologous system of trauma response that involves the limbic system, the connectivity of the limbic system to the forebrain, a bunch of the HPA axis, a bunch of different like neurotransmitters and hormones, and then just the degree to which neural connections are formed, the degree of like synaptogenesis and neurogenesis. So like traumatic experiences, whether we're talking about elephants or chimpanzees or humans, especially early in life, like actually shape your brain structure, like, you know, like your core, like your neurophysiology, and just like the actual like absolute amount of gray matter that you have in certain regions is shaped by your early experience. So that, you know, that's a really like profound illustration of how much flexibility there is and how we really just don't know, you know, that there's no way to like place any limits on the potential range of variation that humans can exhibit. And it's also just like, it's an example of like where science has gotten since the time of these theoretical debates, which I feel like political movements are mostly they're still in kind of like the 20th century, as far as like these debates are still like active and relevant in a way that they just really aren't in science itself. Like you won't hear these in like psychology or anthropology or whatever, like really at all in the same way that you could like 50 years ago, but you will hear them in social movements.
Sorry, you said that it shows the elasticity, say, of the human. But I would also say that it actually we should emphasize that it shows the importance of the material conditions in which the organism develops. And, you know, for humans, and we look at our sociological reality, it's our class system. So like how our material and our class impact on our brain structure, which impacts then on our material and our class system and so on. You know, it's this kind of crazy like chaotic loop. You know, I think we can't underestimate that. That's where it gets difficult. So like when I've listened to your podcast, so with that kind of idea in mind, when we listen to some of the papers that you quote, I'm always skeptical from a kind of a positivist point of view, like as in how, you know, it's very difficult even today when we talk about, say, hunter-gatherer societies, like the hunter-gatherer societies that we look at today that are in tiny, like, what did you say? There was like 100,000 people left, hunter-gatherers, but they actually live in and probably hunt in areas that are encroached upon by non-hunter-gatherer relations and add stress to their organizational structure, much like we see, say, in these elephant populations. So it's very hard for us. This is like, you know, this is the difficulty personally, I think, is like that. I agree, Chomsky is totally correct. You have the ideas of there is a human nature and it is something we should study, but to actually get at what the human nature is, given we actually exist within our class society or whatever, makes even repeatable ones across different, say, geographical areas hard to know whether they actually are the fundamental element or just an expression of how our brain develops within a given structure. I don't know if that makes sense.
I mean, totally. And that, like, that's just like the very, like, that's the inevitable huge burden and fundamental difficulty of trying to understand what we are, is like it is absolutely, like, I mean, all of these kind of like social constructivist frames of reference and modes of reasoning, you know, they all rely on exactly on pointing out exactly that, on indicting our perspectives on the basis of, like, you know, what we ultimately, like, kind of don't know about external reality, or what we might not be aware of just in terms of our own, like, value systems and preconceptions that we're bringing to bear on the study of anything. And it's absolutely true. Like, they're not wrong. You know, I would say that like what characterizes those approaches is taking a very valid point, which is like, we don't know, you know, and then like refusing to ever do what I think is the epistemologically necessary thing of like very diligently seeking out flaws in your perception and like really, like, you know, like assiduously searching for bias, but then at a certain point saying, like, with my imperfect knowledge, I'm going to try to form some tentative conclusions. And I'm always going to try to be humble about how certain I am of this, of anything. I think, like, there's this amazing example that I just came across that I found really mind-blowing, which is that there's this optical illusion that was assumed to be universal. It was assumed to just like be some like characteristic of like basic human visual perception. And it's a little hard to describe without a visual representation, but it basically involves two lines that are of equal lengths. And then there's some other lines at right angles, and one of them appears to be shorter than the other, but it's not. It's just the intersecting lines. And so somebody decided to just take this illusion and see if it was cross-culturally valid, you know, and everybody, like, so many papers had been written about how this was like a basic aspect of human visual perception. And like the assumption was that it was universal. So it turns out that the effect of this illusion diminishes with like a decreasing technological intensity in a given society until you get to hunter-gatherers, until you get to, like, I think they showed it to the San people in the Kalahari, who are not subject to the illusion at all. And the hypothesis is that we develop, it has something to do with looking at all the right angles that are in our environment, you know. And so that's like, I mean, that's like,
that would seem like a fundamental, nearly like a goddamn Platonic form that is in our brains.
totally.
And it's
not,
you know.
And like, and for industrialized people, it is like, there's literally, like, if you study how visual perception works, it's like there's arrays of cells that are all like lined up, and they're looking for lines of a given orientation, you know. So they're like, it's like the way that it actually is in like the literal structure of our brains in these societies. So it's not like a social construct or whatever, right? It's not how people would tend to render that, as everything is just like a function of like socialization and like sort of like narratives that we've inherited from our culture. It's like how this culture has actually shaped our brains, you know? So it's, yeah, I mean,
this is going slightly off topic. I just kind of came across a paper a few months ago on some French guy, and he worked all his life, you know, he was like 60 or something, and he had a low IQ. Like, I think his IQ level was like 75, and they kind of thought it was linked. When he was a kid, he had some like something happened with his brain. He had some disorder or something, but they thought they had cured it, but actually they hadn't. And inside his brain had started filling with fluid, essentially, and it continued throughout his life. And that where his brain should be, there was no brain, it was full of fluid, and there was only like the outside tissue of his entire brain was. So when this guy, I think he died, or they went to give him a brain scan, and they saw that literally he hadn't got any brain, he only had the outside stuff. And he was working as like a janitor in a school or something, and he was perfectly functional, but he had nearly no of the normal brain structure. Everything was just like pure shell.
wow. Yeah.
So like, yeah, talking about plasticity, you know, we go from one extreme. We're saying no, we're all, you know, and then like this French dude turns up and say Foucault is right. On this episode, you heard the theme tune The Order of the Pharaonic Jesters, The Antique Blacks, and Night of the Purple Moon by Sun Ra and his orchestra. Thank you for listening, and please join me for the next episode of From Alpha to Omega. This show is a member of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast and research collective. Make sure to check out our network sister podcasts, General Intellect Unit, Jumpsuit Utopia, Mortal Science, and Swampside Chats.